And welcome to the Gaggle, where we challenge and, if necessary, destroy media narratives. I'm George Samueli, and it is time for the all platform, all seeing, all um, present, all wonderful, all rumble or whatever live stream. Welcome, everybody who has joined me. Um, it's now 9:05 p.m. in Central Europe as we head towards Midsummer Night, which is on June the 21st. And as you know, people who are familiar with my live stream know that that's when I, just throw up my hands and say, well, this is it. This is now we begin the inevitable decline and the time we just be so thoroughly miserable. So, we can enjoy the last few days of June before we reach the Midsummer Night. Anyway, um, I want to start off with the really nauseating spectacle that we had today, which was the June the 6th. I want to make sure that everything's going here. Yeah, the June the 6th D-Day commemorations. And it's really nauseating because it's such a fraud. Now, I remember when um, D-Day was elevated to this particular status, um, because it was really, I think, 1984 when Ronald Reagan went to the Normandy beaches and then delivered I think quite a powerful and effective speech, and that was the 40th anniversary, of course, and there were many veterans, many people who had taken part in D-Day who was there, because that was only 40 years since the end of the war. So the veterans were there, they were in their 60s. So, it was perfectly understandable. They were all around and took part. And what happened then was that Ronald Reagan's speech was somehow elevated into one of the great addresses delivered by any American president, and thus inaugurating this this tradition of these speeches on June the 6th. But there was something, but I didn't fully grasp when that happened, because I thought, okay, well, that was all quite moving, and Reagan, being a film actor, he knows how to deliver a speech. He's good at his line, delivering his lines. He's he had a presence. There's no question. And it was moving. Many of Reagan's speeches were moving. He knew how to deliver a speech. You have to say that. And then I didn't think that much of it, other than, well, this is a moment made for Reagan. And then, of course, 1984 became this glorious year in the history of the Cold War, and of course, the glorious year for the United States, because if you recall, after D-Day, there were, of course, the Los Angeles Olympics, and again, Reagan was there, and so on. But of course, all the athletes from the Soviet bloc countries boycotted the Los Angeles Olympics. It was just tit for tat, because the Americans had boycotted the Moscow Olympics, and because of Afghanistan, and so the Soviets did this. Soviet bloc countries then did the same for the Los Angeles Olympics. Now, and then Romania showed up, oh, well, Romania is pursuing an independent foreign policy, but the Romanian athletes, Ceausescu's athletes, showed up, and everybody loved the Romanians. It was an amazing kind of love fest. The Americans were so grateful that the Romanians showed up. So, given that that none of the Soviet bloc countries showed up, well, the Americans won almost all the medals, and just romped home with all the golds and everything. And instead of basically saying, well, this was a no contest, because if your main adversaries haven't shown up, then you haven't really won anything. I mean, you can't declare yourself the heavyweight champion of the world if your main rivals aren't allowed to compete. But the Americans nonetheless was celebrated it. They ignored the fact that the Soviet bloc countries did not show up, and just took it as a reflection of how well they did, how great their athletes were. And so it became this nameless self-congratulation, even though, if you recall, 1972 Olympics, the Soviet Union won far more medals than the United States, far more gold medals than the United States. And then 1976, again, the Soviet Union won far more medals than the United States, and and in gold medals. And then, of course, 1980, that was the Moscow Olympics, the United States boycotted. And now 1984, and so on. But nonetheless, I mean, somehow the Americans congratulate themselves. So you have the Reagan's appearance on Normandy beaches. Americans felt wonderful about that. Then you have the Los Angeles Olympics, and then you get Ronald Reagan's overwhelming landslide victory in November against the hapless Mondale. And I was puzzled at the time why Reagan won so decisively, because you can't really make Mondale out to be a wild-eyed extremist, nor was he somebody who was a neophyte and very inexperienced and so on. I mean, he had been Jimmy Carter's vice president, and he'd been a figure in in democratic politics for years. So it was always strange, other than a kind of a love and a nostalgia that the American people felt for Ronald Reagan, and somehow the America that Ronald Reagan represented. He did seem like a voice from the past, an echo of what America once was. But the key event, which I didn't see at the time, was this. It was D-Day, because by doing that, by elevating this one event in World War II, the Americans had basically rewritten the history of World War II, which was the key element in this. The key was always to eliminate the Soviet role in World War II, because otherwise the World War II really becomes very, very embarrassing. Because if you want to make it, if you want to say, well, the Soviet, this was a victory of democracy against totalitarianism, well, there was always a fly on the ointment to that story, because you say, well, yeah, but the big winner of World War II was the Soviet Union. It was the Soviet Union, communist dictatorship, communist totalitarian Soviet Union, that broke the back of the Wehrmacht. And so it was very difficult to make it, democracies proved themselves to be superior to the dictatorship, which even if you ignored the Soviet aspect of it, it was obviously untrue, because the Wehrmacht obviously showed themselves to be far better as a fighting force than the armies of the democratic powers. I mean, both the British and the French were absolutely hammered whenever they came face to face with the Wehrmacht. True, Britain won the Battle of Britain, but at the same time, it wasn't really that important because Hitler never was that serious about invading the British Isles. But nonetheless, the key aspect of World War II was the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was the great winner of that war. And that was, of course, very embarrassing because you got a Cold War, which says, oh, the worst people in the world, the worst scum in the world is the Soviet Union, who are your allies in World War II. And if, as Ronald Reagan, who remember this was 1984, he was still on record as saying that this was the evil empire. So the Soviet Union is the evil empire, is going to throw it on the dustbin of history. But then it becomes embarrassing. But they are they were your allies in World War II. Without them, you wouldn't have won the war. So they had to do some very fast thinking. They had to do some rewriting. They couldn't very well just simply write out the Soviet Union from the victory. So they kind of forgot about VE Day, because if it's VE Day, then of course you have to say, yeah, VE Day. So May the 8th, the Allies, and then May the 9th was the Soviet Union, and so on. But if you take this one event from World War II, this one event, you're isolated from everything else, well, then you kind of basically, the Soviet Union didn't really take much part in that. I mean, it was the British, the Americans, the Canadians, so also the English-speaking, the English-speaking people together again, who mounted this attack. So this then becomes this elevator. This becomes the central event in World War II. The central event. This is the turning point, the decisive day on which the war ended, and then you can eliminate the role of the Soviet Union. But of course, even within that context, of course, it was false, because the Soviet Union mounted their offensive to coincide with the D-Day landings, because without that, again, who knows how it would have gone. But the Soviets mounted, when this was planned, this was all planned beforehand, Operation Bagration, a massive Soviet offensive that inflicted very heavy defeats on the Germans, and then actually paved the way for the Soviet thrust into Europe. But all that was kind of minimized by this glorious elevation of June the 6th. The war was decided on June the 6th. And so since then, we've been going through this ritual in which it's completely, the whole issue of what happened on the Eastern Front, Stalingrad, Kursk, the massive defeats inflicted on the Wehrmacht by the Red Army, the Red Army thrust into Eastern Europe and the Balkans, all that's just forgotten. And we're stuck in this wonderful situation, just rhapsodizing about the Omaha Beach and so on. And it started under Reagan, and so that's a very important part of this history, because essentially it's never coming back. We're never going to have any more commemorations of VE Day. That's gone. I mean, that's never going to happen anymore. There's never going to be any joint celebrations of the victory of World War II, the big three, the great allies, well, that's gone. So we'll have the parades in Moscow, the Victory Day in Moscow on May the 9th. And when it comes to the West, we're just going to have these commemorations on the Normandy beaches. Now, but what really was particularly loathsome, disgusting, foul, vile, just scummy, shitty, was today what Biden did, and of course when Biden does it, and then all the people who were there, all those dignitaries, representing countries who had nothing to do with D-Day. I mean, it's like you bring them on. I don't know how many countries were represented at the commemoration today, but almost all of them had nothing whatever to do with D-Day. In fact, they were already on the other side. I mean, Germany, obviously. But the people, all the various Scandinavian countries, again, at best you can say neutral or on the other side. And that goes to the Scandinavian countries, it goes to Ireland, goes to Spain, Italy. And so there's this love fest of people who were had no connection whatever to D-Day. And of course, what it's now transmogrified into is a giant celebration of NATO. And that's what Biden did. Biden gave this speech today about NATO. And that somehow what happened at the Normandy beaches is all about NATO. It's all about Ukraine and it's all about Russia. Russia equals Hitler. Ukraine, I guess, is the entity that needs to be liberated, like Europe was liberated. And all the dignitaries were, also just the old dude 420 says Ireland definitely on the side of the Nazis during World War II. Yeah, I'm trying to be charitable here. I mean, they weren't formally a member of the alliance, but certainly they gave assistance to the Germans. But it's and the media then play along with this. So if you read the accounts in the New York Times and the Washington Post, they all somehow say, "Well, Biden gave a speech very, very different in tone from the speech that Trump delivered in 2019, which was the 75th anniversary. Because he has elevated NATO, that because that's the central part of it. And of course, Trump didn't talk about NATO. And of course, the media all they're doing are just doing a gloss on White House handouts, because of course, what the hell did NATO have to do with the D-Day landings? And again, and this goes back to the whole issue of how you rewrite World War II, which was, well, NATO is directed, first it was directed against the Soviet Union, now it's directed against Russia. The Soviet Union was not just our ally in World War II, but the Soviet Union was the power that made the victory happen. And it can't be emphasized sufficiently that basically Germany was defeated. Germany was completely defeated by June the 6th, 1944. I mean, it really was just simply a shadow of the force it once was. When you put together, how many tanks that could the Allied, could the British and the Americans, basically the Americans, was the Americans put on the field against how many tanks Germany could put, how much artillery the Americans could put on the field as opposed to how much artillery the Germans could, how much air power. Germany had virtually no air power at all by then. I mean, it was overwhelming Allied superiority against Germany. Overwhelming. So by that time, the war was won, and the D-Day landings, the real purpose of the D-Day landings was to ensure that the Soviets didn't just simply march up to the English Channel, that they were going to take everything. They had to basically make sure that the glittering prizes of the war would be in the hands of the Americans, because basically the Americans took the richer industrialized parts of Europe. The Soviets sort of ended up with the poorer, more agricultural parts of Europe. So again, America got in quite late, launched finally their second front in June 1944, and walked away with the glittering prizes, which is, hey, you've got most of Germany, you got France, you got Italy, you got the Low Countries. So you basically have done well with relatively few losses. But all of that has to be subsumed into this fairy tale of NATO, and that somehow June the 6th, 1944 is connected with the creation of NATO. And this is what Biden was talked about today. But that's why it was such a disgusting spectacle. I mean, it was just really loathsome. I mean, to use this event, because after all, no question. I mean, it was still a heroic event that the D-Day landings. I mean, many people were killed, and it was a touch and go whether the Allies would be able to break through the German lines on the Normandy beaches. So they certainly deserve congratulation, recognition for their heroic accomplishments. What they're not really entitled to is to isolate this from everything else that was going on in the war. And they're not entitled to forget about Operation Bagration, where the Russians did this precisely in order to relieve the pressure on the Allies' forces, so that the Germans would have to then divert their armed forces to the east in order to fight off the Red Army. But it's none of this, none of that has anything to do with history. It's all about mobilizing the West for this fight against Russia. And Reagan was the first to do this. And as I say, it wasn't clear to me at the time what Reagan was doing. But it should have been that the reason that this became this huge event back in 1984 was that this was the mobilizing the West against the Soviet Union, against the evil empire. Even though it was obvious that without the evil empire, you wouldn't have been able to win that war. But what's interesting again is that after all that we know about the war, is how seamlessly the media can just peddle that fairy tale that somehow World War II was this victory of the democracies against the totalitarians. It's just an amazing how you can just ignore everything about the war, and then you just sort of isolate this one event and make this into the central act within World War II, the Normandy landings. And but it's very important because the moment that you seriously analyze what happened in World War II, then of course your fairy tales disappear, and then you start having to think about, well, how is it the Soviet Union was involved in that? Well, maybe the Soviet Union has some security concerns given the onslaught that they were subjected to. Anyway, let's take a look at some of the. Well, let me first we'll go to the locals page. It's very confusing, this. Yeah, so the locals page, and we see Danuki. Always good to see you, Danuki. So Yoashdi, George, will Biden finally tell us the story of how he stormed the beaches of Normandy, all three of them leading the charge on D-Day himself? Well, I keep expecting him to do that, and describe his conversations with Eisenhower and General Patton. So I would imagine he'll do that. As I say, I think his speech today was just so disgusting. But Biden has made a specialty of making disgusting speeches. He's always making a disgusting speech. So. But each one is more loathsome than the last. I mean, to use today to attack Russia and to suggest that Russia is Hitler and that somehow the liberation of Ukraine is like the liberation of Europe. I mean, that was just so repugnant even for him. And again, needless to say, he doesn't get any kind of criticism from the media for such a absolutely disgusting enterprise. And then Danuki asks, also, what do you think about the vetting list for Trump's VP that is circulating? Whom do you prefer besides the obvious choice of J.D. Vance and maybe Ben Carson? That list, I saw that. It was a very, very dismal list. Because you have Tim Scott on it, you had Marco Rubio, then we have Elise Stefanik, and as you say, J.D. Vance is on that list, along with Ben Carson. I wasn't impressed. I was a little surprised that he didn't have Tulsi Gabbard. I thought Tulsi Gabbard would be a fairly good bet for him. Because she's a woman. She might have appeal for Democrats. She's nice looking. She knows about military and security stuff. She'll be loyal to him. She won't stab him in the back. I'm not sure about Elise Stefanik. Elise Stefanik, her, any of those people for whom their main concern is Israel, they're people definitely to stay away from. So, but I don't know. Elise Stefanik could, she could end up with getting the nod because you have the Israel thing. She's obviously, and she's a woman, and she's in New York, and I don't know what Trump's calculation may be, because Trump may be thinking in terms that New York is within reach. It's not exactly within reach, but the polls suggest that Biden's lead in New York is 6 to 7 points, which is not a huge number in New York. So it would make sense for Trump to say, okay, well, let's make a push for New York, because if we make a push for New York, it forces the Democrats to campaign in New York, and that means they're not able to campaign in the battleground states. So that would make sense. If I had to bet, I think it may be Elise Stefanik. Obviously, my preference would be J.D. Vance. I just don't think it will be J.D. Vance. I think that he's going to try and play play it more safe. Having a woman, having an ardent Israel supporter, because now he's become so insanely pro-Israel. I mean, he's somehow now calling Chuck Schumer as a pro-Palestinian, and it's getting crazier and crazier. So I if I was going to put down money, I think it'll be Stefanik. But I think it's bad news, and I don't think she'll be loyal to him. So I don't think it even works on that on that level. Anyway, Cynthia, always good to see you. Thank you, Cynthia, as always. Cynthia says, since Carson is black, that ought to ensure Trump not just a win, but a landslide one at that. No one should underestimate how important race plays in American politics, and I'm sure Team Trump is very aware of that. Why do you think Biden picked Kamala as his running mate? She, being a woman, did help him win, but what really helped him win is the fact that she's black, or at least she identifies herself as such. Well, the thing is that the blacks have been pretty much locked in with the Democrats now for decades. I mean, ever since the 1960s. They've gone over to the Democrats en masse. And that's, I think, independent of whether you pick someone who's black on your ticket. You really don't need that to get the black, because you've got the black vote. It's absolutely locked up, and they're not going to be persuaded by or they don't need any additional persuasion by having someone who's black on the ticket. Now, the Republicans have tried to play that game of having a black someone. Well, I don't. There's never been anyone black on the ticket as yet. But to have a black senator, black congressman, it never really works. I mean, yes, Tim Scott has won, but he'd have won anyway. And there's no evidence blacks particularly like Tim Scott. No evidence that Tim Scott would be able to get much black support. So Tim Scott, he's in South Carolina. He enjoys the support of the South Carolina political establishment. That's what got him over the top, not because he has any particular appeal to black voters. So I don't think there's any necessity to get someone who's black on the ticket, because I just don't think it's going to, that in itself isn't going to bring over black voters to the Republicans. Having said that, I do think that Trump does have as an appeal to blacks. That's just Trump himself, not if he plays the quota game and or promising government programs and all that stuff, which he did in 2020, and it didn't really work for him. Hey, I'm trying to overturn the 1994 crime bill, which was pushed by Biden, and say, hey, Biden incarcerated so many blacks, and Trump, I'm releasing blacks from prison. That didn't work for him at all. It was not going to work for him in any way. Blacks voted overwhelmingly for Biden. They didn't think for one moment, oh, the crime bill, he locked blacks up, so therefore, we can't vote for him. That didn't work for him. But Trump does have something about his personality, I think, has an appeal to black voters. There's something about he has a certain swagger that I think appeals to black voters. I think now that he's been victimized by the judicial system, I think blacks are going to have some sympathy for him. So he himself has been eating into the black vote. I mean, the polls have been showing now for some time that he is enjoying support among blacks that no Republican has enjoyed really since the days of Richard Nixon. And Nixon really only had that because back then, the blacks used to support the Republican Party. It wasn't until the 1960s that the blacks switched over from the Republican Party to the Democrats. So, I think it's quite possible that Trump will get a very substantial chunk of the black vote. I don't know how substantial. I don't know. Maybe up to 20%. I mean, it could do it, but I don't think that's because if he hires Ben Carson or as a VP or Tim Scott, I think that in itself isn't going to do anything for him. But if he presents himself as a kind of somebody who exudes vitality, as someone who exudes energy, has a certain entrepreneurial spirit to him, and who is persecuted by the authorities, I think that's going to work for him. But getting Tim Scott isn't going to help him. And I'm not at all sure that blacks particularly like Tim Scott. I mean, Tim Scott's messaging is just ridiculous. I mean, that whole Morning in America, completely wrong. I mean, Ronald Reagan did that in 1984. Nobody in 2024 feels like this is Morning in America. I mean, it's an absurdity. So he tries to pull that stunt, and it didn't work for him, and he failed abysmally. The problem that Trump has, an additional problem that he has with Tim Scott, is that the political establishment, the security establishment, the media, are wetting their lips if they have Tim Scott, because if he has Tim Scott as his VP, then he would be ideal to replace Trump, because once great, we can get rid of Trump, and then we're going to have Tim Scott as president, and Tim Scott is someone we can roll any day of the week. I mean, he'll do exactly what we want him to do. I mean, he's just he's just be the putty in our hands. So Tim Scott really provides Trump with no security against impeachment. I mean, in fact, it almost guarantees impeachment and conviction. So that is a disaster. I mean, Trump really needs to think about he is going to be impeached. How many times he's going to be impeached? I mean, we don't know, but he's going to be impeached at least once if he's elected. So you got all these Republicans who hate Trump, and if they think, hey, we can get Tim Scott in his place, then his conviction is guaranteed. Trump has to select as his VP someone that the political, military, security, media establishment really doesn't want. And I think J.D. Vance would fit that bill, but not Elise Stefanik. So. And not Tulsi Gabbard. That's why I'm surprised that he's not looking at Tulsi Gabbard. Anyway, so then Cynthia goes on. No doubt, all the destruction from war and all the reconstruction needed after war creates a far bigger CO2 footprint than the one created by CO2 emitting car factories and the like. So why does the pro-green media remain silent about this, especially when Biden and other political elites push for green policies while also pushing for more war, not to mention BlackRock and other financial elites that are making lots of moolah on clean tech while dirty wars as well? Well, I think you've answered your own question, Cynthia, because, of course, it's all absolutely dishonest. They don't really believe any of this nonsense about climate change. We know all this. I mean, it's like we had Obama who spent 8 years warning about rising sea levels and the dangers of climate change, and then he buys a massive house right on the coast, Gee, well, why would you buy a house on the coast if you're really worried about rising sea levels? Well, the answer is you're not really worried about rising sea levels. You don't think that, that your house is going to be washed away. It's a fraud. It's something that you batten onto as a way to cajole, bully, harass all the plebs for not being sufficiently environmentally friendly, while you continue to enjoy the good life, flying everywhere on your own personal jet, having houses on the seashore, and of course, as you say, Cynthia, bankrolling these wars. Again, and what you say is absolutely right. I mean, if you are worried about CO2 emissions, then you want to be going easy on wars and military vehicles and military aircraft, because those emit a lot of CO2. So yeah, it just shows it's a fraud. And I mean, climate change has largely been a fraud. Much as COVID was a fraud, it's a way to coerce the public, to control the public, make them feel very guilty about themselves, guilty about their lifestyles. Everything is their fault. It's all your fault because you like to eat meat, and you like to drive your car on weekends, and you like to go on holidays and fly on your passenger jet somewhere. It's all your fault. You're a bad person. But that has been the characteristic of the environmental movement, ever since it kind of emerged in the late 60s and early 70s, which is, it is all your fault, all the terrible fault of the plebs who want to live a decent life. Imagine, the decent life. So they're polluting the atmosphere, they're emitting CO2, destroying the environment, and having factories are being built because of them. So that's the this fraudulent environmental movement. It's typical that, of course, that Obama and Biden, who live in the lap of luxury, making enormous amounts of money, who cheerfully pollute the atmosphere and emit CO2, that they berate others for doing so. Anyway, Cynthia, thank you very much, Cynthia. I really appreciate your tip. And Cynthia says, the only reason I bring this issue up is because we are obviously running out of ways to put a stop to this ever-increasing escalation of the war in Ukraine, which is now only inches away from becoming an all-out world war. So maybe if we frame war as the mother of all greenhouse emitters, with the likes of Biden and BlackRock as the unrivaled ringleaders behind it, then surely enough people across the globe will get on board to kill this war in its tracks. Yeah, nice idea. I don't think it's going to happen. I think that there's just a fatal coalition of pro-war forces that will guarantee that this war goes on. I mean, back in 2002, 2003, when there was the quite a substantial opposition to the impending invasion of Iraq, massive demonstrations in many countries, it failed. And it failed despite these protests because the forces arrayed in favor of war were just overwhelming. They will get their own way. That's it. I mean, they will get their own way. And you can make all the good arguments that you like. And remember, in the case of Iraq, there were many good arguments against it, and because there were plenty of people who were expressing skepticism about the whole weapons of mass destruction theory. There were plenty of people, because of course the pro-war forces in 2003, they weren't limiting their pro-war propaganda just to the weapons of mass destruction. That's a lie to suggest, oh, they only talked about the weapons of mass destruction. No. They also talked about, well, we have to bring democracy to Iraq. We have a responsibility to free the people of Iraq from the totalitarian dictator of Saddam Hussein. So, so there were all sorts of arguments that were presented, and none of them was, of course, convincing. But you just have this pro-war coalition. So your point about the hey, this is in violation of green. Yeah, it's not gonna do any good, because what they've done, and this is what they did with Iraq, and what they always do whenever they spread propaganda in favor of war, which is to demonize the enemy, make the enemy and the enemy of humanity, and that we can't rest, we can't enjoy peace, security, a good night's sleep, while this evil monster is out there doing his evil, terrible things. And that's what Biden did in his disgusting, vile. I keep saying this because I'm filled with such rage for that speech today. It was just so loathsome. I mean, I don't know, I just find him one of the most loathsome figures in American political life. Now, leave aside the president. We know he's obviously the most loathsome president America's ever had. But I think he's always been one of the most loathsome political figures in America. And he always was. Again, I pride myself on identifying Biden long ago, back in the 1980s, as a truly loathsome figure, when he was parading around as a new Democrat, a kind of the neocon Democrat. So once you've created this image of this evil monster who has to be destroyed, because otherwise we can't, we can't rest easy, then that's it. You can put forward any argument you want. It doesn't matter. No one's going to be listening. They're just going to be told, yeah, Putin is evil. We have to do something about Putin. So, I'm afraid, no matter how good your arguments are, it's not going to work. Anyway, Robert, it was good to see you. Thank you very much, Robert. Thank you for your generosity. Robert replies to Cynthia's points, could not have said it better, and nothing contributes to global warming quite like the thermonuclear incineration of the planet. Yep, that's exactly where we are. I saw just before we came on, there was something about France is providing Mirage jets to Ukraine, so all rubbing their hands with glee. Oh, goody! Now we've got this. Anyway, so Robert then says Mercurius had an interesting take on the dramatic escalation against Russia, chalking it up to yet another crazed scheme by the likes of Jake Sullivan to generate the optics of looming nuclear war, rather than the substance of one, with the intent of getting Russia's global South allies to call on Putin to capitulate. So let me see how I understood this. He has an interesting take on the dramatic escalations against Russia, chalking it up to yet another crazed scheme by the likes of Jake Sullivan to generate the optics of a looming nuclear war, rather than the substance of one, with the intent of getting Russia's global South allies to call on Putin to capitulate. So I'm not sure I entirely understand the argument. The argument is that you just have to explain to me, is the argument that the goal is to ratchet up the kind of hysteria of an impending world war in order to get the global South to put pressure on Russia to cave? Is that the argument that basically that the Americans have this strategy that if countries are afraid that we're on the brink of nuclear war, then they're going to get on the phone to Moscow and tell Putin to capitulate. I mean, is that what Mercouris is saying? I don't know. Anyway, I'll wait for Robert to answer. Danaki says 1984 was our best ever Olympics, #2 in the medal count. So when Danaki says our, I'm assuming you mean Romania was the #2 in the medals count, which may well be the case. It's kind of interesting because the Americans used to have, they were the #1 in the medal counts up until 1968 in the Mexico City Olympics, and then 1972 the Soviet Union became the biggest medal count, and then 76 against the Soviet Union. Then 80, obviously 84, the two blocks boycotted each other. Then 88, finally, this was in the Gorbachev era, 88, they were all together. And of course, the Soviet Union got the overwhelmingly the most medals. But, and this was significant, #2 in the medal count was the Deutsche Demokratische Republik. The East Germany got the second number of medals. And this was 1988, and we were then regaled with stories about how everything in the Soviet Union was collapsing, everything was shit, and so on. And yet at the same time, I thought, well, I was thinking at the time, well, if everything is shit and everything is collapsing and no one can do anything in the Soviet Union, how are they able to win all these medals? And I go, oh yeah, it's all drugs, performance-enhancing drugs, they're taking drugs. The problem with that argument, and I'm sure they were taking drugs, I mean, the problem with that argument is that, yeah, but everybody else is taking performance-enhancing drugs as well. And the Americans are certainly taking them. West Germany, they're the masters, Germans have always been the masters of pharmaceuticals. They were the creators of the pharmaceutical industry, so they were specialists in taking all kinds of performance-enhancing drugs. So I never found that argument convincing as an explanation of why the Soviet Union was able to do so much better than the United States when it came to medals. Anyway, Dan Rock, thank you very much. Thank you for your generosity. Marty, also thank you very much for your generosity. Danaki asks, how long will they remain? How long till they remake the D-Day blockbuster with the Russians portrayed as the occupiers? I imagine it's going to be pretty soon. The Russians as these sinister force who are trying to sabotage. We'll have them as trying to sabotage what the British and the Americans were trying to do on D-Day. So we'll probably have the Soviets engaging in secret negotiations with the Nazis, providing the Nazis with information about Allied positions in order to help the Nazis kill British and American soldiers. So the Soviets, because Soviets were desperate to ensure that the British and the Americans were defeated, so that the Soviets could occupy the whole of Europe. So I think that's coming somehow. The Soviets and the Nazis were collaborating in 1944 to inflict defeat on the British and the Americans in Normandy. NKMRD, thank you so much. M62259 says, can we have a movie night for Threads, 1984? I don't know that film, but let me look that up. That's a suggestion. So let me look that up. But Robert says, as you were explaining the major role of the USSR in making possible the minor role of the Allies in the liberation of Europe, I wonder to what extent Stalin was or should have been wise to the US plan to pick off the plum of industrialized Western Europe. He was aware of that. And that's why as in 1941, 1942, 1943, Stalin was really pushing for a second front because he really needed some relief from the pressure that he was under from the Wehrmacht. But 1944, that was already, that wasn't really his concern, because by 1944, I mean, German defeat was inevitable, and so therefore the opening up a second front wasn't really such a big deal for him, and he was definitely aware of basically that the Americans and the British now were desperate to take as much of Europe as they could. But yeah, I mean, it's when you look at the Soviet Union won the war, but in a way, who won the peace? I mean, the Americans won the peace. The Americans took the best, the richest part of Europe. The Soviets got something, but really, in comparison with what the Americans got, it's a pittance. And even if you look at what they got, it was by no means clear that they would even get that. I mean, Czechoslovakia had never been there were no wartime negotiations about Czechoslovakia, so it was assumed that Czechoslovakia would not be within the Soviet sphere of influence. I mean, it was just, I mean, the communists in Czechoslovakia kind of seized power, but there were no Soviet forces inside Czechoslovakia until 1968, after the invasion, and Hungary as well was by no means clear. Again, if you go back to the wartime agreements, they concerned Germany, how they were going to divide up Germany. Remember, Germany was going to be divided up among 4 occupying powers. So in fact, the Soviets were going to take 1/4, and the Western powers, who of course consolidated their occupation zones, they took 3/4. You got the British, the French, and the American zones were all consolidated into what became West Germany. So you had, the Russians, they take 1/4. And incidentally, again, within the wartime agreements, there was supposed to be reparations payments, which means that they were going to take some of the industry from Germany would be used to help reconstruct the Soviet Union after all the devastation. Good luck with that. They never got anything. I mean, it's like they never got any of that reparations from the industrialized West Germany, and they never, of course, got any reparations payment. None. No reparations payment at all from West Germany. So, and again, I mean, the Soviets did ship some industry from what they got, which was, of course, Poland, and Hungary and Romania, but there's just no comparison when with what they ended up with, and what the Americans ended up with. I mean, and then what the Americans then ended up with, they was consolidated into a bloc. I mean, they consolidated into that NATO bloc. The NATO bloc, which already came into existence in 1949. So already within 4 years, the Americans already consolidated, the chunk, the bulk of Europe that they took over into a military bloc directed at the Soviet Union. Anyway, Robert says Tucker unmasked Tim Scott as just another neocon warmonger. Yeah, that's exactly right. And that's why I think it would be absolutely catastrophic for Trump to pick him as his number 2, because not only is he a neocon warmonger and somebody who really isn't very bright. I mean, it's clear he really isn't very bright. I mean, he's been pushed because, hey, he's a Republican and he's black. I mean, and that's what Republicans do. They push somebody. Oh, he's black. I mean, this is the new face of the new Republican Party. But he guarantees Trump's impeachment and conviction, because if they think I can get him in there instead of Trump, boom, he's done. And then he brings up the question of Richard Nixon. You remember Richard Nixon was, from really, I mean, Watergate really gets into the seriousness of Nixon's problems in Watergate became apparent already in the spring of 1973, and Nixon himself was already aware by the summer of 1973 that he would be impeached. The question then was, of course, if Nixon were impeached and convicted, then his successor would be Spiro Agnew. Now, Spiro Agnew had been a very shrewd choice on Nixon's part because, I mean, well, first of all, Agnew had a reputation of being a liberal. He was a liberal governor of Maryland. Maryland was a kind of, is a border state, important for the Republicans to win, in a very close election, which they did win in '68 because of Agnew. So it was a very shrewd choice on Nixon's part, and then doubly so because then Agnew became this firebrand because he hired these really good speechwriters, chiefly Pat Buchanan and William Safire, and he suddenly became a kind of a national celebrity with his alliterations. There was his famous alliteration, the nattering nabobs of negativism, and the pusillanimous pussyfooting, and by '72, when Nixon was running for re-election, I think it was a given that Agnew would have a very strong claim to be, the nominee in '76. So what happened was that the deep state in the summer of 1973 went into operation, because if you get rid of Nixon, you get Agnew, and if you got Agnew, then you're bringing in Pat Buchanan and so on, and so they wheeled out the various stories which they'd known about for some years about his having taken bribes when he was a governor of Maryland. I mean, big deal. I mean, this is something. I mean, in those days, all politicians did that. Of course, they took bribes from contractors who wanted to do work for the Maryland government. So anyway, they brought that out, and they were determined. The Justice Department was absolutely determined to prosecute. Imagine that. We have to prosecute. Can't stop. We have to prosecute. By a strange coincidence, they absolutely determined to prosecute Agnew, just as Nixon is getting seriously embroiled in this Watergate problem. So, go ahead, here it is. We got to prosecute. No, we can't do anything. So all this time, remember, this goes back years and years to the time that he was the governor of Maryland. So, we have to prosecute, and of course, I mean, I think they probably had Agnew dead to rights, and basically, they brought these charges. Agnew, pleaded no contest, but the deal was, of course, that he resigns, and that sealed Nixon's fate, because once Agnew was gone, then it's a done deal that there's no problem now about pushing Nixon aside. And then Nixon did something which I'm still not exactly sure why he did it. He appointed as his vice president Gerald Ford. Now, Gerald Ford, I mean, he was the sort of the Tim Scott of his day. Not very bright, He was he was a congressman from Michigan, and he really got to be minority leader. He was minority leader simply because back then Republicans had very few seats in the House. So in 1964, the Republicans were absolutely hammered. That was the assassination election, Johnson versus Goldwater. Republicans got absolutely killed in that election. So there really weren't very many Republican congressmen, and so that's how Gerald Ford got to be minority leader. And so once Nixon made him his VP, then he was done. He was guaranteed, because the Democrats and the deep state or whatever, they knew this is a guy we can roll. It's going to be fun. He's not going to put up any resistance. He'll do exactly what we want from him. I mean, it's just it's just shooting fish in a barrel with Ford. So they loved having Gerald Ford there. He was a sort of a Mike Pence of his day. But as I say, I never understood exactly why Nixon did that. Why he picked Ford as his running mate, because Nixon was a very shrewd political operator, and he had to have known that having Ford there was going to seal his fate. I don't know why he didn't choose John Connally. Was the guy that he really liked. He was fond of. He got on well with the former governor of Texas. But I think Connally, Connally was already, I mean, this is how the deep state always operates. I mean, they were already bringing charges against Connally. I mean, remember, boom, they suddenly brought all sorts of criminal charges against Connally. There was no basis to them, but they were bringing the charges precisely because they didn't want Connally in that position. They absolutely determined that Nixon hire Ford, and then Nixon steps aside in favor of Ford. So Trump, has to absolutely ensure that there's no Gerald Ford, Mike Pence around, because otherwise he's done, and done very quickly. Anyway, so Brown, 1958, says, it's all the psyop for the dollar grift and the power grift. How does 0.1% control the 99.9%? Yeah. They wrap the grift in the virtuous, slaving the planet, saving grandma, saving. Oh, we need to take all your stuff and rights to save everything. Yeah, absolutely. They're saving it, and obviously to whip up hysteria, and to make people feel as if they personally are responsible for the problems of the planet. You horrible person that you are responsible for all the pollution of the planet. You are responsible for all the CO2 emissions. It's like that woman, what was her name? That girl, who says, "How dare you? How dare you do this to us? How dare you destroy the planet?" But of course, it's and that you're absolutely right. That's how you control 99.9% of the population. You have to get them to believe, that 99.9% of the population, that they are worthless, that they're rubbish, and that they have to cede all power to the all-seeing, all-knowing 0.1%. That's because we're terrible people, and so therefore you are the sort of wise men, and it worked. The strange thing is, I mean, the one place where there's some resistance is, I think, the United States. So the United States runs everything, but it's also the one place where there is some resistance. I mean, the reaction that set in against Fauci is very interesting. There hasn't been anything comparable in Europe. I mean, Europe, they beat the opposition down. Literally, they beat the opposition down on COVID and the lockdowns, and it wasn't difficult. And you know, even on Ukraine, I mean, they beat all opposition down with relative ease. You know, so I mean, there is, at least in the United States, there is some desire for liberty and not to surrender all freedoms to a self-anointed expert group, you know, as represented by somebody like Fauci. You know, that I am science. You know, I am science. So, but you know, they pulled it off with some aplomb in with COVID, and you'd have to think they're going to do something similar again. It was so easy. It's like, you know, taking candy from a baby. M62259 says, could you walk us through how war in Ukraine could escalate into a global nuclear exchange? Well, the way I would envisage is, I mean, this is one scenario, is that as these attacks on Russian territory escalate, you'd have to think there are going to be more and more of these attacks. Russia would have to retaliate. Now, how would Russia retaliate? Well, Russia's not going to hit U.S. territory right away. I mean, that would be needlessly escalatory. I would assume that what Russia would then do, they would start hitting American satellites. Since Putin has explicitly said Ukraine is incapable of launching these attacks on our territory, you need satellite technology to do so. It is the Americans who provide the satellite technology, and he's also said it was and the British as well. He says, so basically, when it comes to from attacks from this ATACMS, which is the American system, or attacks with the Storm Shadow, which is the British system, and then whatever the French name is, those can only be done by use of satellites. So if they're done by use of satellites, that means that basically the Americans are doing it. And essentially the Americans are the ones who are firing missiles onto Russian territory and killing Russians. So that's basically that. I mean, Putin said this explicitly actually yesterday when he was talking to the heads of the news agencies. All right, so then what does Russia do? Well, I think the first step would be to hit the satellites, hit the AWACS systems, hit all the drones in the Black Sea. Maybe then hit some airfields if these Mirage jets or the F-16s are using airfields outside of Ukraine, maybe in Poland or in Romania, then hit those airfields. So at this stage, Russia is limiting itself to strictly military targets. But nonetheless, those are American weapon systems. Now, you then have to ask, well, what does United States do in response? Well, if the United States was sensible, of course, the United States, they would say, hey, we're now in a very dangerous spiral. Let's knock it off and see if we can work something out. If the United States doesn't go down that path, then the United States escalates and directly, not even using the as Ukraine as a cutout, which is what he's been doing at the moment. It's using Ukraine as a cutout to attack Russian territory, but then the United States directly, unambiguously targets Russia, starts hitting Russian targets. Well, then I think you get into the next stage of exchanges. Again, the Russians target military bases, American military bases in Europe. and American military infrastructure in Europe, and then once you go in this tit for tat, you can see where that goes. That's how I would envisage this step-by-step escalation. So probably Russia would as a first step, would attack the satellites, the AWACS, anything that the Americans are using to help Ukraine, and then leave it up to how will the Americans respond? I imagine the Americans they won't go for negotiations. They'll respond by directly hitting targets inside Russia, and then once they've done that, then of course Russia would start hitting targets in America. So that would, I think, be how I would envisage it. But I have to say, though, that the Russians are very, very anxious not to escalate. Russia is very, very anxious not to get into any kind of any kind of an exchange with NATO. It's been very, very wary of a war with NATO, and it's just going out of its way, however provocative. It's basically saying, hey, we don't want to go down to this step. So I want to just show you, see if I can do this. Let me go to, because I want to show the what Putin said yesterday, which I found kind of disappointing. So let me go to this. Where are we? Yes. So, yes. So this is from the transcript of. Can people see this? Anyway, this is what he's talking about at this news conference. And he's saying that Ukrainian military personnel cannot do everything on their own and launch strikes with these missiles. They're simply technologically unable to do this. You need to have satellite reconnaissance. Then based on this satellite reconnaissance, and this is American, blah, blah. What can Ukrainian military personnel take part in? And they can say which goals, blah, blah, blah. And then it says, if it's ATACMS, then the Pentagon is doing it. If Storm Shadow, it means the British are doing it. And in the case of Storm Shadow, it's even simpler. The simplicity lies in the fact that the flight mission is entered automatically without the participation of military personnel on the ground. Automatically, the British do it, that's all. And then he goes on, what should we do in response? And he says, first, we will, of course, improve our air defense systems. We will destroy them, the projectiles launched towards Russia. Secondly, we are thinking about the fact that if someone thinks it is possible to supply such weapons to a combat zone to strike our territory and create problems for us, then why do we not have the right to supply our weapons of the same class to those regions of the world where will strikes be carried out on sensitive targets of those countries that do this in relation to Russia? That is, the answer may be symmetrical. We'll think about it. Now, that's good. Yeah. So, boom. Now, what I found troubling about that is that he's not really envisaging the reasonable steps that he needs to take to stop this Western escalation against his country. Because it's clear that the NATO powers, United States, France, UK, and Germany, have decided that Russia is just bluffing, that there's nothing to be afraid of. Russia is afraid of us. We're not afraid of them. We can do what we like. We can attack his country. He's not going to do anything. the worst they're going to do is, Medvedev is going to send out another blustery tweet. So he hasn't said anything there that suggests that he's somehow going to bring this insanity to an end. I mean, and that's why the limited strikes that I was describing, well, I thought that would be the minimum. But nonetheless, he's not saying that, well, we'll improve our air defenses. And then we're going to do this thing of we'll make symmetrical strikes. And I don't understand what would be, where would Russia be able to make symmetrical strikes against the United States and Britain? Well, you're going to provide arms to Mexico, so that Mexico is going to attack the United States. Well, good luck with that, because if you did do that, the Americans wouldn't tolerate this for 1 minute. They would then. The Americans are not going to be like the Russians, that could just tolerate attacks on American soil. So the one possibility that might fit into that scenario would be Israel and Iran. So in other words, Russia provides arms to Iran, and then Iran can attack Israel. Well, I mean, I don't know. Has he asked Iran whether Iran wants to do that? Because if Iran uses Russian weapons to attack Israel, then Israel is going to launch a massive attack on Iran, and Iran's then got a very serious crisis on its hands, fighting a war with a nuclear-armed Israel. Does Israel want that? Or if you're going to do this with Syria, again, Syria is going to attack Israel. Again, Israel can just pulverize Syria into complete oblivion. So I just don't understand what Putin is saying there. I mean, how in what kind of symmetry to make life difficult for the Americans? I mean, the Americans are not just making life difficult for the Russians. The Americans are actually making an absolutely existential attack on Russia. They can say, we attack your territory. We're using our missiles, our satellite technology to kill people in your country, and you are incapable of responding to us. I just don't see how any Russian leader can live with that. The whole point of Putin, why he came to power, was he was going to protect the Russian people. And now you're not going to do the obvious next step, the one that I envisage. Maybe there are other steps that he could take, but you can't just, the NATO powers have tasted blood, and now they feel that it's an absolute freebie for them. They can hit Russia with everything, and Russia will not respond. I still think that cannot go on. That Russia will respond, but yesterday's performance by Putin was I don't know, disappointing to say the least. Anyway, let me go back. Anyway, Danaki said, sorry to say, but we're in the midst of this ever escalation solely because somebody's unable or unwilling to finish what they started. Yeah, I agree. It's something, it should have been done in February 2022, or if you couldn't do it, then don't do it. I mean, if Russia didn't have the resources, didn't have the manpower, didn't have the military hardware, then to finish the job off, then don't do it. Wait a couple of years. Build up your strength and wait to do it. But if you start something and then you don't do it, and you can't just say, well, we didn't think NATO would go all in. Well, how can you not think that? I thought that. I said it at the time. I was on RT on February the 24th, and I said, hey, I think Russia needs to finish this off very quickly because NATO is going to make a big commitment to Ukraine. So you want to finish this off before NATO turns it into a major war for Russia. And then Robert says the question I asked, yes, to provoke hysteria over the fear of a nuclear war without intending to trigger one as a way of driving a wedge between Russia and its allies. Okay, that may be. Yeah, it's. I don't. First of all, I don't think that's going to work. And it's to be honest, it has a certain the sophistication that I don't think Americans have. But I don't think it's going to work. I mean, I don't think. I mean, if you're being attacked by American missiles, then you got a real problem on your hands. And if the South African president gets on the phone and says, "Well, whatever you do, you mustn't start a nuclear war." I mean, I don't know why would you be persuaded by that? I mean, if you are persuaded, again, you shouldn't really be the leader of Russia. I mean, you should be, as a leader of Russia, your only concern should be, well, what makes Russia secure? But what does it matter what Lula says to you, or even Xi Jinping? I mean, is Xi Jinping doing anything? I mean, is he providing weapons? He's not doing anything. So yeah, I just don't see it. Cynthia says, I haven't seen Buddy in quite a while. No, he seems to have vanished, which is a good thing. Surely he wasn't put out to pasture in order to just lie around shooting the breeze and listening to the dueling banjos all day long. But if that's the case, surely he's been given the Godfather status or something akin to that. Just no one will think he's an old dog who's become too old on the way. No, I think Apple has kind of taken over as this nasty, belligerent hound who's always just thinking about money, money, and never really giving any thought to any of the important ideas that we like to discuss. So I don't give any, I just want money. So I think Buddy's just sort of, given up, and he's just sleeping, and he's allowing Apple to pick up the slack. Anyway, then Rock says Hollywood has already started rewriting the history of the world wars. They use blockbusters that aren't serious. At the end of one of the Kingsman movies, they have a young Hitler meeting with Lenin, totally pathetic, but it slowly creeps into the psyche of the dumb viewers. Yeah, no question. I mean, that whole way of rewriting World War II, I mean, that's very much, it's Hollywood. It's the European Parliament. It's today's leaders, and then you have the Biden speech today, where apparently it's all we have to mobilize against Russia, and that's the spirit of World War II. Somehow what we did in World War II, the British and the French, we got together, liberated Europe. Now we British, French, Americans, Canadians. Now we've got to get together through NATO and liberate Ukraine and maybe liberate Russia itself from that. Because after all, if you're making the equation of Putin and Hitler, then obviously you're not just going to limit yourself to Ukraine. Next step, you have to liberate Russia from Putin. So that's that, and so part of that obviously is you have to rewrite history. So R. Brown, 1958 says they took out Agnew so they could insert Ford, so they could then take Nixon out. Yeah. There are no war prophets during peace, heaven forbid. Yeah, no, that's exactly it. And I think that, because now that I'm thinking, why didn't Nixon select John Connolly? I think that was it. I think because there were already now all the talk about, they're bringing criminal charges against John Connolly. He was under investigation as well. And nothing ever came of it. Nothing. It was a fraud, the investigation of John Connolly. But it ensured that Connolly wouldn't get that slot. They wanted Ford in there. They knew that they could roll Ford. Ford was an absolutely dismal, pathetic figure. Nice guy, but so what? I mean, I'm sure Tim Scott is a nice guy as well, but that's not someone you want in that slot. And then R. Brown says Ford led the House investigation of the JFK assassination. Yeah, he was on the Warren Commission. They rubber stamped the insane lone gunman theory. Nothing to see here. Move along. Yeah, but again, he was there, in order to provide the sort of imprimatur he wasn't the one running it. You had Alan Dulles there, so but Ford was just there. Yeah, we need the Republican, the House Minority Leader, and then it says Nixon probably picked Ford because the Senate Republicans probably said they would stop the impeachment if he did pick Ford. Yeah, who knows? I mean, the Republicans were so abject and supine back then, but it may be that Nixon took on board what they said. I mean, if you can recall what happened in August 1974, because Nixon, as he moved into August 1974, Nixon still had the votes in the Senate. You need 34 votes to survive an impeachment trial. So obviously Nixon would be impeached by the House, so in the Senate. But there were still some Dixiecrats who I think would support Nixon, and most of the Republicans would still support Nixon. So he probably could still count on getting the 34 votes to survive. But what happened was that there was the smoking gun tape, which of course was a total fraud, an absolute fraudulent, bogus, nonsensical document, which had nothing to do with Watergate. Absolutely nothing to do with Watergate. It was to do with this money that they found on one of the Watergate burglars, and then they traced this money to the committee to re-elect the president. But the whole purpose of that, and then Haldeman says, well, this investigation is going in directions we don't want it to go. But the reason for that was that there were a number of big corporate CEOs who were supporting Nixon, but they didn't want it to be publicly known, like Donald Kendall of Pepsi Cola. So they paid money in cash, and they just because they didn't want to leave a trace of as a donation to the committee to re-elect the president. So basically, they wanted that kept secret. But for whatever reason, this money, I think it was Donald Kendall. The money, ended up in the pocket of one of the Watergate burglars, and so basically they traced this money. This was Haldeman was telling him. This was in the famous smoking gun tape. Haldeman was telling Nixon, "Well, we got they found this money on one of the Watergate burglars, and it's basically this is money that can be traced to these donations." And then Nixon said, "Well, I mean, let's try and save any embarrassment to Donald Kendall." And we'll tell this the FBI that this was a CIA operation and whatever. But what was important about that is that he had nothing whatever to do with Watergate. I mean, it was about to avoid embarrassment to Donald Kendall. And the point was that Nixon had completely forgotten about this conversation because it was just nothing. It goes back to June of 1972. Nixon had forgotten about it. And he only remembered this when he was listening to the tapes, because he had to handle the tapes over, and then he kind of listened. And when that, when he was forced to publish it, all the Republicans, ran for the hills, and they said, "Oh my God, I said that I would support Nixon. I'm not supporting Nixon. I'm going to vote to convict. I'm going to vote to convict. I'm going to vote to convict." And all the Republicans, the ones in the House who had actually voted against impeachment, so that's it. I'm changing my vote. Impeach, impeach, impeach. Including what's his face, the guy who was the Senate Majority Leader from Mississippi, Trent Lott. He was on that Watergate Judiciary Committee. But anyway, I mean, if it had been the Democrats instead of the Republicans, they would have actually mounted a defense and said, this has nothing to do with anything. which everyone was preoccupied with, all the stories that John Dean was telling and everything else. This was a separate issue when they were, Nixon was just trying to protect these donors. He wanted to protect the anonymity of these donors who paid in cash. And as I say, Nixon had completely forgotten about that conversation. But had it been the Democrats, they would have fought ferociously for their president who was being lynched. But anyway, Dan Rock says Betty Ford Clinic is Ford's most famous legacy. Yep, that's the one. She was another. God, I don't know if people remember her. What an utter pain in the neck. But yeah, she was a. There were a lot of those strange women at that time. She's one of them, and there was John Mitchell and his wife Martha Mitchell, was also nutcase plus alcohol and so on. So we got all that. There were these women, and which these men seemed completely incapable of controlling their women. And the 60 cents. Good to see you. It's about 1:10 p.m. in Silicon Valley. That's good. I'm reaffirming a robust contribution to Buddy's and Johnny Apple's money pot, so they remind you and Peter to consider Dr. Morteza Mohud. Yeah, that's a good suggestion as a guest on the Gaggle and Crosstalk. Yep. Last month, Dr. Mohit was frozen out of Danish TV for his challenging corporate media narratives. Okay, that's a good suggestion. Cynthia then brings up Nadia Comaneci. Yes, did she win? She won 3 gold medals in 1976. To be honest, I thought she actually won more than that. But I remember Nadia Comaneci that I think she got a perfect 10, and something she got a perfect 10, and no one had ever done that. I think the all-round things, but so I would have thought 1976 was the best ever Olympics for Romania, at least in terms of gold medals. You have to take this up with Dinaki. I'm not sure. I mean, I just remember the sudden popularity of Romania. I mean, Americans never heard of Romania until 1984 when they said, "Yeah, we're taking part." None of the countries of the Soviet bloc, not Hungary, not Czechoslovakia, none of them was taking part. And other than Romania, yeah, we're coming. And then suddenly everybody loved the Romanians. Anyway, Dinaki says, every day that goes by only serves to reinforce in my mind Rorik's take on Russia and Putin and highlights the ridiculousness of the Xenon propaganda spiel, 5D chess moves and all. Yeah, I have to agree with you. I mean, I think, we talk about all these different scenarios, and then kind of Putin sort of takes the air out of that balloon with this very, very weak response to the question that he was asked yesterday. Anyway, Brown says, couldn't Russia hit America by hitting Europe by turning off all energy supplies to Europe? That could well be. I mean, I guess Russia might think, hey, we don't want to hit civilians, so we don't want to hit ordinary citizens of Europe, because that's going to turn them against us. I mean, I can see that argument, but but certainly, I mean, that's a possibility. Again, I would go for the military facilities and American military facilities and see how the Americans respond. And because then it'll be up to the Americans to decide, okay, you really want to escalate, you really want to take this to the next level, okay, go ahead, take it to the next level. I mean, that's what I wouldn't necessarily try to make life miserable for ordinary people, because they don't really care very much about the war. Having said that, allowing Ukraine to go on making money by transiting gas across its territory doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. Art Brown says, you and Peter did a great job analyzing FJB's interview with Time magazine. God, I laughed almost as often as I winced. Brilliant tag team work with both you and Pete. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. It's painful, and like if you read his speech today, it's very, very painful. It's no fun doing it because he's such a loathsome character. So if one can add a little bit of humor, that relieves the strain of having to go through his gibberish. But thank you so much. And then Danaki says about this is energy. They could have done that already 2 years ago. Not only that they didn't do it, they are to this day paying Ukraine for gas transit. Yep. So there goes that strategy down the drain. Obviously, there's no interest from the Russian side to stop it. Yeah, I guess so. I mean, what puzzles me, and is that this just continues, and there just doesn't seem any way out of this. Russia doesn't seem to have any war-winning strategy, because thinking that Ukraine is going to collapse, betting the farm on Ukraine collapsing, and that's not a strategy that's working. I'm not at all sure Ukraine is going to collapse, or at least not in the foreseeable future. But that seems that the strategy that it's going to Ukraine is going to collapse. But the fact is that now it becomes less and less likely if you allow NATO to attack Russian territory. So I don't get exactly how Russia then plans to win this war, because there's not going to be a peace conference. There's not going to be a peace conference. There's not going to be any peace negotiations, and the Western powers aren't going to give anything to Russia. Now, maybe they think, there'll be an election, Trump will get in, and then Trump will say, I'm going to end this war or whatever. I mean, those are possibilities. But I don't see that as a realistic plan. I mean, I think that, my view is Russia needs to hit American targets, and then present it to the Americans, leave it up to the American people, and say, is this what you want? Do you really want this war on behalf of Ukraine's borders? What Ukraine's eastern border should be. That's it. Is that what you want? Is that where you want to go? R. Brown says Republican politicians are like sheep. They scatter at the first hint of danger. Yup. Democrats are like sheep. They huddle up and do what the shepherds tell them. Absolutely. Judy says Putin emphasized a distinction with the use of long-range and short-range weapons. The UK has greenlit the use of their long-range missiles, but the US has not. What Putin was saying did not make sense if you think that his main concern was hitting back at the US. Only makes sense if, like Putin's earlier threat to use tactical nukes. Putin has never threatened to use tactical nukes. I know you say this, but he has never threatened to use tactical nukes. Is if the threat is aimed at the UK, not the US. That's the only way it makes sense. It makes no sense for Putin to threaten the UK. The UK is not his problem. I mean, that's it. The US is his problem. And I don't get why he would need to threaten the UK, and because in any case, even if you threaten the UK, I mean, the UK can hit back at Russia. So I mean, in any case, the US hasn't ruled anything out. The US has simply moved on to the next step, and then it is going to move further on. So these kinds of hard and fast rules, where you can only use these missiles in this way. Yeah, you can use the HIMARS, but not the ATACMS. That it just doesn't really work for a very simple reason. The U.S. has in the past drawn up red lines for Ukraine. Well, don't do this. Ukraine has crossed those red lines, and the U.S. did nothing. The U.S. is not going to abandon Ukraine if it uses the long-range missiles in the way the U.S. doesn't want. So like the U.S. said, well, don't hit oil refineries. and then the Ukraine hit the oil refineries. Well, yeah, that was obviously, hey, don't carry out assassinations, and then Ukraine carries out assassinations. So, I mean, because otherwise, then you'd have to say, well, what does the red line mean? The U.S. is going to abandon Ukraine? Well, it's not going to do it. I mean, this is a major foreign policy commitment on the part of the U.S. Anyway, Tanaki says the Russian judge withheld her grade for quite a while before caving. They scored it 1.0 or 1.0. They didn't have the 2-digit boards. I think we're talking about what's her, I guess the Nadia Comaneci, and they had scored a perfect 10 before. Incidentally, her coaches were a pair of ethnic Hungarians, Marta and Bela Karoly, that ended up, they coaching the U.S. team. Yeah, no, that's right. I remember that. Yeah. R. Brown says, in an escalating situation, the Russians can revisit option they passed on before. Yeah, that's possible. No question. That's possible. But Danaki asks, reasonable when? In 5 years' time? Yeah, I again, that goes to the question: is that you know, for Russia, for no one is time in indefinite. You've got a window, you can keep going, year in, year out. I don't see it. I just there's going to be a point when Russians are going to get fed up. I mean, it happens to everybody. They're going to say, "What's the point of this war? We're losing manpower, and we don't have a strategy for victory. There's no end game here. We're going to fight 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 years. So 10 years time, we're still going to be fighting in Ukraine, still going to be losing men in Ukraine. So I don't think Putin has just an indefinite amount of time. I think at some point the Russians are going to say, look, if you can't win this war, then abandon it. But that's it. Abandon it. Abandon the Donbass. Abandon trying to keep Ukraine out of NATO. But at least we're going to be alive. At least we're going to maintain our lives. So that's why I think that there isn't that indefinite amount of time. Russians will fed up. They got fed up in World War I. They didn't get fed up in World War II because there was a strategy for victory. Anyway, Judy, thank you so much. Judy says, or maybe you don't believe that the U.S. has not greenlit use of long-range missiles against Russia. A separate White House briefing, both National Security Director Kirby and Mike Carpenter reasserted this week that unlike the UK, the US did not greenlight the use of long-range missiles against Russia. Do you not think that Putin knows that? Well, what we know about the United States is that the United States escalates its involvement. The United States goes step by step. There's to get ever deeper involvement. So when the United States says, well, we don't really support this, what does that mean? It means we don't support it today, but we will support it next week. What's important always is to cross a red line and then wait. And then once you've done it, then you move on to the next stage. I mean, I just think these pronouncements, well, we haven't supported that. Yeah, you haven't supported that, but there were all the other steps that they said they wouldn't support. Remember, initially, the American position was no use of American weapons on Russian territory. Initially, there was no use even against Russians inside Ukraine. So they said, well, they crossed that line. They said no use of on Russian territory. They crossed that line. They didn't even want attacks on Crimea. They crossed that line. So now they're onto the next step. So if I'm Putin, I'm thinking, well, okay. The Americans also said no attacks on oil refineries because that's going to really hurt Biden's re-election chances. And how did Ukraine respond? Boom, they attacked Russian oil refineries. No assassinations, boom, assassination. So I just don't think the Russians take very seriously any of these American strictures. And then Tanaka says, I think there's the highest chance we will be debating Putin's next measured response 5 years from now as well. Well, Rob Brown says, yeah, you could be right. Time will tell. All right, so let's see. We've been, what else is here? Go back to what's on the Rumble page. Let's see. God, this is, wow. God, this is, going through all these, a lot of points here on the Rumble page. Some of which, it's quite complicated. I go from one window to the other, and this is really quite complicated. Okay, so let's see. All right. So just somebody. So Chris John writes, as I see in the UK newspaper, it's looking like it's been World War III, Britain and Russia, and I like the people in Russia. Yeah, no, the British are very much in the. They're getting all ready for war. Anyway. So yeah, okay. Let's see. Not have a relative in your NATO command center. Okay. Choosy heretic. Says NATO is essentially illegal papal army. Never should have existed beyond the Swiss Guard. Even they have ridiculous outfits. Yeah. No, yeah. NATO should never, definitely never. And there were people who, back in 1948, 49, during the debates in the Senate, were dead set against it. They said, no, we don't. NATO is a really bad idea. It's going to end very badly for us. Anyway, so Gunny 1972 says D-Day was a bloody mess. Yep, that's for sure. Not going to diminish the resolve all the guys that landed, but strategically it was hyped up. Yeah, I think so. The argument I also like is that I wonder whether the people, those young men who performed heroically, it was a difficult military operation, who performed heroically during the Normandy landings, what they think of America 80 years on. What do they think of Europe 80 years on? And I would be very surprised if many of them, I mean, obviously not alive anymore, if many of them will say, yeah, I think this was worth it. I think this, the America that emerged out of World War II, this America is really, it's a really cool place. And we're glad that we made all these sacrifices. If they came back and said, they were watching Biden's speech today, watching all these pompous foreign dignitaries, where they think, yeah, that was worth it. I sacrificed my life for this. My friends sacrificed their lives for this. Yeah, I'm so glad that for the America of 2024, that was definitely worth fighting for, because that's what Biden was saying. This is wonderful thing that they were fighting for. This America, this Biden's America. I wonder how many of those people in Normandy would think that, yeah, this is what we were fighting for. In fact, if they had an idea that this would be, that the result would be the America of 2024, I think they would have just gone home. I said, we're not going to land on the beaches of Normandy. We're going to go home. I want to go home. I don't want to do this. Tomislav says more Serbs were prosecuted in The Hague after NATO destruction of Yugoslavia than Nazis after World War II. Yeah, I think so. And moreover, other than the top Nazis, in the first Nuremberg trial, the big Nuremberg trial, where a number of them were sentenced to death, the Germans were much more leniently treated than the Serbs. I mean, the Serbs, and particularly the Serb leaders, Most of them got life imprisonment, and very, very long prison sentences. Whereas, as I say, other than the top Nazis in that first Nuremberg trial, most of them was just a revolving door. They just did a few years in prison and walked. I mean, Albert Speer, responsible for a hell of a lot more crimes than any Serb, he just did 20 years. If any Serb were given 20 years by the courts, then the prosecutors would immediately file an appeal and say, oh, this is too lenient. Too lenient. You've got to increase the prison term. And that happened all the time. If a judge gave a lenient, and it was a little game they played. The judge would mete out a sentence like 20 years, and then the prosecutor and the judge knew that the prosecutor would appeal. Oh, no, that's too lenient. And then the appellate court would turn in and say, no, 20 years is too lenient. Let's make it 33 years. And I mean, Karadzic was sentenced to 40 years in prison. And, this is an elderly man, so 40 years is effectively a life in prison. Prosecutors immediately appealed. No, 40 years is too lenient. And so, yeah, the appellate court said, yeah, definitely too lenient, life in prison. So, so Gunny says, Gunny 1972, Biden's son still takes drugs, right? I'm starting to understand why. Yeah, I think that's a very good point, because there are interesting aspects of the Biden children. I mean, there's Hunter, who leaves a computer at the computer store. Who leaves a computer? I mean, leave aside that you've got a lot of very personal, damaging stuff on your hard drive, so you're not going to just leave it there just like that and forget about it. So you kind of wonder, was that the idea that he wanted people to discover it? Same with Biden's daughter, the one who kept a diary. Who the hell loses a diary? I mean, you have a diary and you put all your personal thoughts and then you just leave it. I mean, diaries are kind of first thing when you go anywhere. The first thing you're going to pack. You're not going to make sure that you don't leave it. So you kind of wonder about Biden's children, whether they wanted, these very their personal documents to be discovered. Anyway, Choosy Heretic says Rome's permission for the USA to nuke Japan depended on the agreed upon condition of Operation Paperclip and the world central banking system. So the world needs the world needs peaceful revolution. Olympics, they started 50 years ago in Portugal, 1974. Well, that didn't go very far. I mean, the moment it seemed like the communists were going to take over, the powers that be moved in to prevent the communist takeover. But it was an interesting one, because for a while it looked like the communists would take power in Portugal. But no, then the Germany moved in, West Germany moved in, but to make sure that that didn't happen. Of course, the Americans moved in. So, so anyway, let's see. Gunnar says, "How's Jill Stein doing?" I don't think she's doing very much. Gunny says, democracy is the weapon of mass destruction. Distraction. No, that's exactly it. Gunny says, Biden was so disgusting when Scott Ritter had his hearing. Yeah, that's an interesting one. I think you can still get that on YouTube. Biden's condescension towards Ritter. Remember, Ritter then, of course, changed his view, but Ritter at the time was saying, no. I mean, Saddam Hussein is weapons of mass destruction, and the Clinton administration is letting Saddam Hussein get away with it. So then he testified in the Senate, and there was Biden grilling him, and condescending to them. Well, I think, I think these kinds of questions are sorted out by people somewhat above your pay grade. But of course, then Biden turned around, was it 4 or 5 years later, and said, yes, Saddam Hussein has weapons of mass destruction. So after all the weapons inspected, yeah, he has weapons of mass destruction, just as when he had argued the exact opposite against Ritter. See. Anyway, so yeah, so I see. Yes, because this, I'm going through this again. Some of them appears on local, so. So, yeah. And for the computer store, they put an Apple II where the computer store Apple II was my favorite, but used it. Hunter Biden has his own movie. Anyway, I think my time is up. I think there's a lot of comments there. And thank you everybody for all of your fascinating insights and questions and ideas and suggestions. Really appreciated a really good discussion. Even if not everybody's in agreement with me, and I'm not in agreement with everybody, but that's what a discussion is there for. So thank you very much. I'm going to have to deal with Buddy's replacement and address the painful issue of why am I not raising enough money? I'm doing my best, but Johnny Apple's as unsympathetic to that argument as Buddy was. So that's my burden. Anyway, thank you everybody. Thank you for doing this. So we're going to have some more podcasts over the weekend, and then we'll resume with the live streams next week. So thank you. Have a great weekend, and we will be back next week. All the best. Good night.